Welcome, curious listeners, to The Deep Dive. Today we're going to journey back in time to a really vibrant and surprisingly influential corner of history. One that, well, it fundamentally shaped modern entertainment. Think of this as your shortcut, maybe, to being genuinely well-informed on something truly unexpected.
That's a great way to put it. We're pulling back the curtain on the original cheap thrills, you could say.
Ah, yes.
The fascinating, often notorious world of pulp magazines, these publications, they're frequently dismissed as just lowbrow, right?
Yeah, that's the reputation.
But they were actually an incredibly dynamic and foundational cultural force.
Okay, so our mission in this deep dive then is to go beyond just the history, the dates, and facts. We want to unpack what these wildly popular publications truly were.
Right.
And how they managed to captivate millions of people. And maybe most importantly, why their particular blend of sensationalism and escapism, this appeal that just brilliantly tapped into what you might call universal cravings for clear stories, for excitement, why it was so incredibly powerful.
And enduring, too, shaping popular culture as we know it today, really.
Exactly. So tell us about the sources we're drawing on for this.
Well, our sources for this dive, they paint a really rich tapestry of details. We're drawing from informal histories of the pulp magazine era, alongside specific discussions of key magazines, their iconic characters, and their lasting impact.
Sounds like a goldmine.
It really is. It's a goldmine of forgotten yet profoundly influential stories just waiting to be explored.
Okay, so let's start at the very beginning, then, laying the groundwork. How did these cheap thrills gain such unprecedented mass appeal? So when we hear pulp magazine, what exactly are we talking about? What was their sort of core identity back in the early 20th century?
Okay, so at their heart, pulps were the direct, mass-produced successors to the 19th century dime novels.
Right, the dime novels.
Exactly. But they weren't just entertainment. For millions, literally millions of people, they offered their first and only taste of literature.
Wow, that's huge.
Think about the impact of that. For a vast segment of the population, these cheap magazines were their introduction to sustained storytelling, beyond maybe just oral traditions or basic school texts.
That's almost revolutionary, like you said, for something often seen as just throwaway entertainment. And the name pulp itself, that gives us a clue about their defining characteristics, right?
Absolutely. Their identity was intrinsically linked to how they were made and how much they cost. They were cheaply priced and printed on low-quality wood pulp paper.
Oh, there it is.
Which, as you noted, is exactly where the name comes from. This meant they could be mass-produced. The physical quality wasn't great because of the paper, obviously.
Right. Disposable.
Disposable, easily digestible in terms of content. They were inherently disposable, titillating, and hugely popular. And this cheapness, it wasn't a flaw. It was strategic, designed to make them accessible to the absolute widest possible audience. It basically democratized fiction in a way that hadn't really been seen before.
So accessibility was absolutely key. And part of that mass appeal, that hook for everyone, was often rooted in a certain kind of, well, sensationalism, wasn't it?
That's a really crucial point. While they had a huge variety of content, pulps definitely became best known for their lurid, exploitative, and sensational subject matter.
Okay.
Now, that luridness, it might have only been one part of their total content, but it was a key marketing tool.
The hook.
The hook, exactly. It was designed to grab your attention immediately on a crowded newsstand, pull in a broad audience looking for instant excitement, immediate escapism. It was, integral to their identity as just unvarnished, no-holds-barred entertainment. Hashtag tag 1.2, the visionaries of cheap entertainment.
It really sounds like a carefully crafted formula for success. Who are the pioneers? Who figured out how to make this work on such a massive scale?
Well, one of the earliest and most impactful figures was a guy named Frank Munsey.
Munsey?
Yeah. He's often described, pretty unflatteringly actually, as applying the talent of a meatpacker, the morals of a money changer, and the manner of an undertaker to journalism.
Ouch. Doesn't sound like a nice guy.
Maybe not, but it highlights his utterly pragmatic approach. He wasn't driven by idealism or, social causes. His sole focus was on founding or buying magazines that earned well. That was it.
Pure business.
Pure business. And he was ruthless. He'd just kill them, shut them down if they failed to turn a profit.
So pure pragmatist. And his big innovation came with Argosy magazine. That seems like it was a really pivotal moment.
It truly was. Back in 1896, Munsey tinkered with his argosy, and he transformed it into an all-fiction magazine. That itself was pretty novel at the time.
All fiction, okay.
But crucially, he made the switch to rough wood pulp paper because he thought the story was more important than what it was printed on.
That's the insight, the content, not the package.
Exactly. The narrative was the product, not the expensive, high-quality paper it was printed on.
And that simple choice, it sounds simple, but it had this profound economic advantage, didn't it?
Yeah.
It sort of cemented the whole pulp model for years.
Precisely. See, unlike single-doing novels, which weren't eligible for the low second-class postal rates.
Ah, the postal rate.
Yes, pulp magazines were eligible. This meant huge cost savings on distribution. They could send them all across the country incredibly cheaply.
Wow.
So Munsey's new package for mass fiction was this fat, affordable magazine. It let him provide just unprecedented quantities of entertainment at a price point that made it accessible to the working class, to almost everyone.
And the market just ate it up, I imagine.
Absolutely ravenous for it. Argosy just boomed. It went from a few thousand copies to over 500,000 in just 6 years.
500,000.
In 6 years.
Yeah. That rapid, exponential success just proved the viability of the entire model. The demand was clearly there.
That kind of growth really illustrates the demand, doesn't it? It sounds like Munsey basically created a new industry standard overnight. Who followed him? Who expanded on this formula? That would primarily be Street and Smith. They were already a big player, a well-established dime novel publisher.
So they knew the market.
They knew the market. They saw Munsey's success and quickly launched the popular magazine in 1903. They even competed directly, marketing it as the biggest magazine in the world.
Bigger than Argosy.
Well, they claimed it was bigger, though technically it had less text because of different page layouts and bigger type marketing.
Right. But they also brought their own innovations, didn't they? Something visual that really caught the eye.
You're right to highlight that. Street and Smith were pioneers in introducing color covers to pulp publishing.
Ah, color. That's huge.
It was. While Munsey's Argosy initially just had text on the cover, no pictures.
Really? Just text?
Just text initially. Street and Smith realized the power of visuals. Adding vibrant color artwork for the popular magazine was a brilliant marketing move. It added another layer, a really compelling layer of visual appeal to those cheap thrills, made them even more irresistible on that crowded newsstand.
Makes sense. And they didn't stop there, right? They also started specializing in genres. That seems like a smart way to broaden the appeal even more.
Indeed. That was their next key strategy, introducing specialized genre pulps.
So not just general fiction anymore.
Exactly. They started launching magazines dedicated to specific genres, like detective stories or romance or westerns. This let them capture even more targeted segments of the mass market, tailoring content to very specific reader interests. It cemented the idea that whatever you were craving, there was probably a pulp magazine for it.
Okay, so with that shift to color covers, it's clear that visual appeal became absolutely critical. How did this art of the sell, as you called it, really manifest itself on those covers?
Well, cover art played a truly major part in the marketing of pulp magazines. No question. These covers were the primary hook.
The first impression.
The first and maybe only impression. They were designed to capture attention immediately. Think gun-wielding gangsters, square-jawed detectives, seductive femme fatales, and damsels in distress. Always in these dynamic, stop-action images.
High drama.
Maximum drama. This overt sensationalism wasn't just decoration, it was the sales pitch. A vibrant, screaming billboard trying to grab your eye on a packed newsstand. The cover had to basically tell you the whole story, or at least promise a thrilling one, in a single arresting image.
And the artists behind these covers, they weren't just anonymous hacks, right? They became kind of famous within the pulp world.
Oh, many were incredibly talented and became masters of the specific dynamic visual language. People like George Grosz, Margaret Brundage, Walter M. Baumhofer, Earl K. Burgay, Virgil Finlay.
Yeah.
Just a few of the really celebrated pulp illustrators.
Wow.
Their work, far from being dismissed, often came to define the very genres they illustrated. It became iconic.
What's truly fascinating and a bit mind-bending is the relationship between the art and the story. You'd assume the story gets written first, then they commission a cover, right?
That's the logical assumption.
But often it was the other way around.
That's one of the most intriguing details, and it really underscores how dominant the visual appeal was in pulp marketing. Sometimes they would be designed first. Authors would then be shown the cover art and asked to write a story to match.
Get out. Seriously. Write the story to the cover.
Seriously, the cover wasn't just representing the story. Sometimes it was its actual genesis, the direct inspiration. It just highlights the industry's keen understanding of what sold magazines, that immediate visual impact. Image first, story second, sometimes.
That's a wild way to produce fiction. What about the art inside the magazines? Was it just as vivid? Obviously not color, usually.
Right, interior art was typically black and white, but it still played a crucial role in enhancing the narratives, setting the mood. Frank Hoffman, for instance, he perfected this black and white dry brush technique using India ink and watercolor.
Dry brush, okay.
Yeah, it was a style ideally suited to reproduction in line on that rough pulp paper. It looks great, even on cheap paper. And it inspired countless imitators among pulp illustrators. It became a kind of hallmark style, conveying drama and atmosphere effectively, even without color.
So even the interior art had its own aesthetic.
Definitely. Now, sure, some art was probably hurried or inept, given the crazy production schedules.
Of course.
But there were quite a few good men illustrating, as one source put it, who created really memorable and effective work inside those magazines.
Okay, so with this mass-produced, sensational, visually driven content, who exactly was this huge audience the pulps were aiming for? Who was buying these things?
Well, the primary demographic, generally speaking, was typically identified as a young, lower-middle-class male audience.
Young men. Okay.
They were drawn in by that vivid cover art, which, let's be honest, often featured voluptuous women in need of rescue. It was a clear, deliberate marketing strategy appealing directly to the interests and maybe anxieties of young men at the time, offering thrilling escapism.
Right. But this is where it gets really interesting for me. Beyond just providing thrills, do these pulp magazines have any broader, maybe unexpected societal impacts that historians have picked up on?
That's a crucial question, and the answer is actually pretty remarkable, yes. Many urban youths, immigrants, and other lower and middle-class males were drawn to the pulps and became literate reading popular adventurous, spicy, and true crime stories.
So they learned to read or improved their reading because of pulps.
Effectively, yes. The accessible language, the engaging stories, the unpretentious nature of the content. It served as a crucial entry point to reading and literacy for a huge portion of the population.
Wow.
It was entertainment that maybe inadvertently built a reading habit. It served a vital educational role, you could argue, without ever really setting out to.
That's fascinating. Now, while the focus often seems to be on that male audience, the gangsters and detectives, the damsels in distress, the pulps weren't exclusively for men, were they? There's a big female readership, too.
Oh, very much so. Absolutely. There were tons of romance and confessional pulp periodicals, specifically aiming for a female readership.
Like what kind of titles?
Titles like Ideal Love, True Confessions, All Story Love Stories. These catered to different romantic interests, different societal expectations of the time. It really demonstrates the wide appeal across demographics.
So romance pulps were a big deal, too.
Huge deal. In fact, you know the Harlequin romance novels, massively popular today.
Sure.
They trace their predecessors right back to this era, to the romance pulps. It shows how the pulp format successfully tapped into diverse markets for what counted as cheap thrills back then.
Amazing. And there was a famous editor in that space.
Yes, Daisy Bacon. She was known as the Queen of the Wood Pulps. She edited Love Story magazine, and she famously defied the customs of the Whirlwind 20s by championing straight, old-fashioned romance. She believes there was a huge audience for sentimentality, for traditional courtship stories.
Hey, was she right?
Absolutely. Her strategy paid off big time. She drove circulation to over 500,000. It just proved the massive market for those traditional sentimental themes, even alongside the shoot-'em-up adventure stuff.
Okay, so these pulps were immensely popular. They were accessible literature. They appealed across genders. But what kind of stories were they actually telling? And why did they resonate so deeply? It often seemed to come down to the hero, didn't it? The main character.
Precisely. The hero was central. As the historian Daniel J. Borston defined it, a hero is a human figure, real or imaginary or both, who has shown greatness in some achievement. And the pulps, well, they excelled at providing a seemingly endless supply of these figures.
And from a psychological standpoint, it makes a lot of sense that these heroes were so compelling, doesn't it? Especially for a younger audience, maybe people still figuring things out.
You're absolutely right to connect it to psychology. It's noted that mass entertainments of any period will invariably be much concerned with action and identity. Think about it. Dr. Benjamin Spock, the famous pediatrician, He noted children's delight in stories where good is pitted against evil and always wins.
That simple clarity.
Exactly, that fundamental psychological need for reassurance, for clear moral outcomes. And the psychologist Erik Erikson, he observed young people's absorption with roles and occupations, and that big question of how to connect the roles and skills cultivated earlier with the ideal prototypes of the day.
Finding your place.
Finding your place. The pulps, with their very clear-cut heroes and villains, they offered both distractions from and simplified solutions to these anxieties. They directly addressed that universal need for clear identity, for reassurance, for conflict resolution in a world that often felt, well, increasingly complex and uncertain.
So the pulp hero wasn't just a character in a story. They were almost like a cultural balm, providing both action and alternate identity, a kind of blueprint for navigating life, maybe.
That's a great way to think about it. They offered models, simple models often, but powerful ones.
Okay, let's dive into some of these iconic archetypes then, and the worlds they lived in. Where should we start? The Wild West. That seems like a quintessential pulp genre. But it's interesting, the source material notes that this Wild West was almost invented before the cowboy became the figure we recognize today.
That's a key historical detail, yeah. The earliest Western heroes weren't necessarily the cowboys of popular myth, the cattle drivers. They were often the trailblazers, hunters, scouts, figures like Daniel Boone, Kit Carson.
Frontiersmen.
Exactly. And Professor Henry Nash Smith, a historian of the West, he made this great distinction. He said that for Americans back then, there were two quite distinct Wests. There was the commonplace, domesticated area within the agricultural frontier, which he called tedious.
Tedious.
And then there was the Wild West beyond it, and that West was an exhilarating region of adventure and comradeship in the open air.
Ah, the Fantasy West.
The Fantasy West. And that distinction speaks directly to the escapist appeal of the pulps. They offered this thrilling, idealized version of freedom and adventure that was just a world away from the often mundane realities of everyday life for their, mostly urban raiders.
Makes perfect sense. So who were some of these iconic figures that really captured the imagination? Who embodied that exhilarating, untamed West for pulp readers?
Oh, Kit Carson's fame, for example, just soared after the Mexican War. He appeared in weekly story papers portrayed as a renowned Indian fighter, daredevil horseman, slayer of wild animals. He was often depicted as a loner, self-contained in a vast, savage wilderness.
The rugged individualist.
The ultimate rugged individualist. Then you had characters like Deadwood Dick. He was a freelance, a man of independent income who travels the Wild West and just delights in righting wrongs. He even had his own coterie, his group of pals, and sometimes teamed up with the famous Calamity Jane.
So a bit more social, maybe.
A bit. And then there were characters aimed at younger readers, like young Wild West. He was the champion deadshot of the West and Prince of the Saddle, another freelance adventurer just seeking adventure and whatever fortune. These characters provided really clear aspirational roles, figures of independent action, moral clarity, thrilling adventure in a world far removed from the factory floor or the office desk.
Okay, so as America became more urbanized, that hero archetype naturally shifted, didn't it? Moved from the frontier to the city streets. The detective stepped in, perfectly adapted, as the notes say, to the confused traffic and bewildering ways of the rapidly growing city.
Exactly. Detective stories just substituted a detective for some other man or hero. They offered a new kind of urban champion, someone who could navigate the maze, the labyrinth of modern city life.
And Nick Carter was a big early one.
Huge. Nick Carter became wildly popular, partly due to his ingenious props and stunts. Like, he apparently wore a dummy hump sometimes to maintain his disguises.
A fake hump.
Seriously. That's the kind of detail readers loved. He eventually had a long pulp career and even transitioned into being a paperback spy later on. Shows the longevity of these characters.
And speaking of iconic figures, you can't talk pulps without mentioning the Shadow. Almost synonymous. How did that mysterious crime fighter get his start?
The Shadow's origin is interesting. He actually began just as a voice on the radio in 1930 narrating a detective show.
Just a voice.
Just a voice. Then Walter B. Gibson, a prolific pulp writer, expanded him into a full-fledged pulp novel hero in 1931, giving him a physical presence, a backstory.
And that famous look.
His appearance kind of evolved, sometimes described early on as wearing like a black monk's outfit, but eventually settling into that sharp-nosed, slouch-hatted figure we often picture, cloaked in darkness. He operated with a whole compact army of crime busters, including his famous alter ego Lamont Cranston, Police Commissioner Weston, Joe Cardona, and even his trusty cab driver, Mo Shrevnitz.
The whole team. And there were others, too, like Jimmy Dale.
Yeah, Jimmy Dale, the Gray Seal. He was an earlier mystery man, another wealthy playboy type who adopted multiple identities to fight crime. His calling card was leaving behind these little blood-red, diamond-shaped stickers.
It really seems like there was a powerful hunger in these stories for a kind of justice that went beyond the slow, maybe ineffective official legal system. A lot of these heroes were basically vigilantes, weren't they? Operating outside the law.
That's a really core theme in the urban detective pulps, yeah. It speaks directly to that maybe universal desire for direct action, for clear resolution, especially when the system seems broken or slow.
Like the Whisperer.
Exactly. The Whisperer, for instance, was a policeman by day, but by night he became this vigilante with no rules or regulations deterrent in the path of justice. Just went out and did what he thought needed doing. Then you had the Avenger. He was this wealthy world traveler whose family was murdered, so he forms Justice, Inc., operating out of Greenwich Village, again, totally outside the law, to get what he saw as true justice. And notably, his crew included Josh Newton, who's pointed out as one of the few intelligent black men in the pulps at the time.
That's an interesting detail. And the Black Bat. Sounds intense.
The Black Bat. He was Assistant District Attorney Tony Quinn, blinded by crooks, but then he gets this secret eye transplant pulp science that lets him see in the blackest darkness.
Okay. So he gets superpowers, basically.
Kind of. And he uses them to fight criminals with their own methods. Ruthless with the disregard for the law. He made his own rules as he went along. That's the perfect embodiment of that desire for unconstrained, immediate justice that clearly resonated with an audience often feeling powerless themselves.
And the private eye genre specifically became hugely influential, didn't it?
No.
Giving us figures that still echo today. Who were some of the key pioneers there?
Well, Race Williams, created by Carol John Daly. He was a real trailblazer. Described as a tough, straight-shooting, wise-talking, pragmatic, urban cowboy.
An urban cowboy. I like that.
Yeah. He was cynical, didn't trust anybody, but, could be sentimental about a girl in trouble. Classic trope. His approach was all about simple, active means for solving problems. No long explanations, no discussions of evidence, just action.
Get the job done.
Get the job done. And his popularity was immense. Apparently, just having his name on a black mask cover could boost circulation by 20%.
Wow, that's direct impact. And then you have these literary giants who actually started out writing for the pulps, like Dashiell Hammett.
Indeed. Hammett cut his teeth in Black Mask, sometimes using the pseudonym Peter Collinson. His characters like the famous Continental Op or Samuel Spade.
Same Spade.
Right. They were often detached, world-weary, but still ended up helping people in trouble. What's fascinating is Hammett said he just wanted to record his unique experiences on paper, mostly from his own time as a Pinkerton detective, even though he admitted he knew nothing about fiction writing when he started.
Just raw talent and experience.
Exactly. It highlights the raw, experimental nature of pulp fiction. It was a proving ground, a place to try things out.
And another huge name, Raymond Chandler, also came from that pulp world, defining the hard-boiled detective.
Chandler, yeah. Though he was apparently quite self-deprecating, called himself a careless writer and muddy thinker.
Really? Chandler said that?
According to the sources, yeah. But he undeniably defined the genre for many. His stories, often set in that shabby wonderland of Southern California, painted this not very fragrant world, as he put it, that he could shape into interesting and even amusing patterns. His work, like Hammett's, really elevated the genre beyond just simple, cheap thrills into something with real, lasting literary merit. It showed that pulp fiction could achieve artistic significance.
Okay, so we've covered the West, the city, but pulps also offered adventures further afield, right? Global thrills, inviting readers to join the World Adventurous clan, as one source called it, for those with a staunch heart or just a real desire to be one.
Absolutely. This tapped into a really profound desire for escapism, for grueling experience and thrills and distant climes. And it wasn't entirely fantasy. There were real-life adventurers whose stories maybe fueled this. People like Trumbull White, who bicycled across America, or Frank G. Lenz, who tragically died trying to cycle around the world in Kurdistan.
Real adventures inspiring fictional ones.
Exactly. And writers like Talbot Mundy, who became a celebrated author, he traveled extensively in India and Africa, went big game hunting, intensively studied native magic. These real-life experiences directly fed the appetite for fictional ones, kind of bridging the gap between reader fantasy and perceived reality.
But then you get into the really wild stuff. The special agents battling these outrageous, often quite political threats, tied into the anxieties of the time.
Oh, yeah. Operator 5, also known as Jimmy Christopher, he's a prime example of just how audacious this genre could be. His mission every single month was to save the United States from total destruction. No pressure.
Every month. What kind of threats?
The threats were wildly over the top. He was an expert in disguise, had a concealed sword in his cane, classic stuff. But he faced things like Asiatic robots, an inhuman leper scourge, and a villain called the Yellow Vulture who was masterminding a Japanese invasion of America.
Wow. That's not subtle.
Not subtle at all. It vividly reflects and absolutely played upon the geopolitical anxieties of the era, particularly fears about Japan in the lead up to WWII. But it delivered those fears in these thrilling, totally escapist packages where the hero always won, no matter how outlandish the threat. Maybe that was comforting for readers facing a scary world.
I can see that. And the high-flying air combat heroes were another really popular category, right? Dogfights and aerial thrills.
Definitely. G8 and his Battle Aces, written by Robert J. Hogan, started focused on World War I air battles, but pretty quickly incorporated stronger, fantastic-type plots. We're talking bat-like monsters, attacking planes, stuff like that.
Bat-like monsters, okay.
Then there was Dusty Airs, the top eagle of Uncle Sam's brood. He fought a future war against an enemy known only as the Blacks, led by this emperor named Fire Eyes, Emperor of the World. Again, really reflecting those anxieties about foreign threats and future wars. These agents provided thrilling action, sure, but also reassured readers about national security, offering these simplified narratives of good versus evil on a global stage.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Science fiction and fantasy also found really fertile ground in the pulps, didn't they? Offering readers worlds literally beyond imagination. Who was the driving force behind that genre's explosion?
That would have to be Hugo Gernsback. He was actually an electrical engineer first.
An engineer.
Yeah. Ironically, he failed to market his own invention successfully, but he found immense success when he launched Amazing Stories magazine in 1926.
Amazing Stories. That's the big one.
That's the landmark title. His goal was clear. Offer readers planet-hopping adventure, satiric thoughts about the future, trips through time to the past. He published established giants like H.G. Wells and Jules Verne, but also launched brand new talents like E.E. Doc Smith. Gernsback effectively laid the groundwork for modern science fiction as we know it.
And E.E. Smith, you mentioned him. He had a science background too, right? A Ph.D.
He did. Dr. E. Smith had a Ph.D. in chemical engineering, and he truly pioneered a whole subgenre within sci-fi. The space opera.
Space opera. Love that term.
It's perfect, isn't it? His novel, The Skylark of Space, which started serialization in Amazing Stories in 1928, was revolutionary. It was the first to really extensively explore the incredible power to be had from the release of intra-atomic energy. Think nuclear power, but way beyond.
Wow. So, big ideas.
Huge ideas. His stories were epic in scope, set on galactic stages filled with slashing space battles, heroes with superhuman qualities. He brought a kind of scientific plausibility, or at least ambition, to the fantastic, creating these grand, sweeping visions of the cosmos.
But not all science fiction in the pulps was about, grand scientific concepts, was it? Sometimes they got weird. Really weird. And one editor apparently capitalized on that.
Ah, yes. That brings us to Raymond A. Palmer. He took over editing Amazing Stories in 1939, and he made a highly controversial decision. He started publishing Richard S. Shaver's Tales of the Darrows.
Darrows. What are Darrows?
According to Shaver, Darrows were these malevolent, degenerate beings living in caverns deep beneath the surface of the earth, causing disasters and madness up here.
Okay. That's pretty out there.
Extremely out there. And it caused a huge uproar among the more traditional sci-fi fans and writers. They thought it was nuts, basically thunder science damaging the genre's credibility.
Right.
It doubled the circulation of Amazing Stories within just 4 months.
Doubled it. Just like that.
Just like that. It's a fascinating episode. It proved how sensational, even bizarre or fringe content could appeal powerfully to a mass audience's curiosity, their desire for the unexplained, regardless of its perceived literary merit or, frankly, its basis in reality. Controversy sells, right?
Clearly. Now, another hugely popular genre, maybe bridging fantasy and adventure, was the Jungle Lord. epitomized by one character everyone knows, Tarzan.
Tarzan of the Apes. Edgar Rice Burroughs' creation was an absolute global sensation. He triumphed over his environment. He embodied this kind of true nobility despite his wild upbringing. It particularly appealed, the sources say, to adolescent boys.
The ultimate fantasy of self-reliance and mastery over nature.
Pretty much. And Tarzan's immense success naturally led to a whole host of imitators. You had characters like Khazar, who was raised by lions instead of apes.
Okay, slight variation.
And Kigor, who appeared in Jungle Stories magazine from the late 30s all the way into the mid-1950s. These stories offered this idealized return to nature, a world where strength, instinct, maybe a kind of innate nobility prevailed over the complexities of civilization.
And for readers who crave something maybe more raw, more brutal in their fantasy, there was the swords and sorcery genre, which really found its home in the pulps too.
That's where Robert E. Howard comes in, a towering figure in that genre. His tales were described as bloody and hyperthymic, meaning full of energy, maybe manic energy.
Intense stuff.
Very intense. His heroes included figures like Solomon Kane, a grim Puritan adventurer fighting sorcery, and what were described back then as ferocious black men in Africa, reflecting some of the exotic and definitely problematic portrayals common in that era.
Right. Important to note that context.
Very. He also created King Kull, a barbarian king from the darkness of unrecorded time. But his most popular character by far, the one everyone knows, was Conan.
Conan the Barbarian.
Conan the Cimmerian. The enormously muscled barbarian who became the most popular character Weird Tales ever got hold of. Conan's life, as described, was basically spending his days alternately dallying with lovely princesses and slave girls and fighting monsters, sorcerers, rival warriors, you name it.
Living the dream, barbarian style.
Maybe. These stories were visceral, they were direct, action-packed. They provided a really powerful outlet for primal fantasy, for heroic adventure unburdened by complex morality.
Okay, so while adventure and sci-fi were huge, the pulps also carved out a really significant niche for darker, more macabre tales. What was the pioneer magazine for horror that brought these kinds of stories to the masses?
That would definitely be Weird Tales. It was known as the perennially tottering Chicago-based pulp, meaning it always seemed on the verge of going broke.
Struggling but influential.
Exactly. It first appeared in 1923 and quickly became the rallying point for all sorts of monsters, ghosts, ancient evils, cosmic dread, the whole spectrum of the uncanny. It was edited for much of its classic run by Farnsworth Wright, who, despite suffering from Parkinson's disease, had this clear vision for the unsettling and the strange.
And Weird Tales, it introduced some truly unique voices, didn't it? Writers now considered foundational in horror literature.
Absolutely. Clark Ashton Smith, for instance.
Yeah.
He contributed these incredible stories of exotic beauty, horror, terror, strangeness, irony, and satire, often with these fantastic, almost gibberish titles, as one source calls them, that hinted at their otherworldly, decadent content. His prose was incredibly rich and unique.
And the big one, Lovecraft.
And of course, H.P. Lovecraft. He was a significant, maybe the most significant contributor to Weird Tales. His seminal story, The Call of Cthulhu, which basically launched his whole cosmic horror mythology of ancient, indifferent gods. Cthulhu. It first appeared in Weird Tales. These authors, along with others like Robert Bloch, who wrote Psycho later, they really pushed the boundaries of the macabre for a mass audience, shaping the horror genre for decades to come, right there in those pulp pages.
Amazing. But then, on the complete opposite end of the emotional spectrum, you had the intensely melodramatic, the sentimental side with the romance pulps. It really shows the sheer breadth of the pulp market, doesn't it?
It really does. Love Story magazine, which launched back in 1921, was huge. It famously featured stories published under the name Bertha M. Clay.
Bertha M. Clay. Was that a real person?
It was actually a house pseudonym. The original Bertha M. Clay was a popular British author from the 19th century who had died long before, but her name was such a successful brand in earlier dime novels that Street and Smith just revived it for their pulp magazine. Multiple authors wrote under that name.
Clever branding. And the editor there was Daisy Bacon, the queen of the wood pulps.
That's her. And as we mentioned, she famously defied the customs of the whirlwind 20s, the era of flappers and jazz, by championing straight, old-fashioned romance. She believed readers craved sentimentality, traditional courtship narratives.
And she was right.
Totally right. Circulation hit over 500,000. The heroines in these stories assiduously defended their virginity. The plots revolved around finding true love against obstacles. It proved that even these very traditional, maybe conservative, sentimental themes had a massive market. It showed that cheap thrills could also be sweet and wholesome, catering to a whole different set of foundational desires.
It's just staggering to think about the sheer volume of stories needed to fill all these magazines, month after month, week after week. The demand was clearly insatiable. That must have meant an incredible, almost industrial level of output from the writers and artists. This wasn't exactly a leisurely pursuit, was it?
Oh, far from it. Leisurely is the last word you'd use. The sheer volume and, crucially, the speed of production were just staggering. It defined the careers of many pulp creators. Writers operated on what you can really only describe as an industrial scale.
Like assembly lines for fiction.
Almost. Take Frederick C. Davis. He famously wrote a short story every week. Every single week. And get this, he did it while maintaining impressive academic ratings in college at the same time.
Short story every week while in college.
Well, it's human.
Inhuman.
It speaks to the sheer discipline and speed required. It wasn't about waiting for inspiration. It was about hitting deadlines. Robert Sidney Bowen, another prolific writer, he averaged 150-odd short stories and novelettes a year.
150?
A year. That works out to something like 400,000 or 500,000 words yearly, just churning it out. And Merle Constaner, who actually held a master's degree in medieval history.
Oh, highly educated.
Highly educated. But he described his pulp writing work as a solitary sort of kitchen table profession. It emphasizes the intense, often lonely grind needed just to keep up with those relentless deadlines from the pulp publishers.
It sounds less like, creative writing as we might picture it, and more like contract manufacturing, like churning out widgets, but the widgets are stories.
That's honestly a pretty accurate analogy for many of them. A large number of pulp writers were basically contract novelists. They were paid a flat fee, often by the word, or for a specific length, like a 45,000-word feature needed for the next issue of The Shadow or Doc Savage or whatever.
So they were writing to order.
Writing to order on a fixed schedule. This relentless production cycle was purely dictated by the need to feed the insatiable demand of that mass market. It was a high-volume business model applied directly to storytelling, where efficiency and consistent output were often prized above all else. Hashtag tag 4.2 the talented and the typecast.
Okay, given that kind of insane output, and let's face it, the often lowbrow reputation of pulps, it's probably not surprising that many authors and illustrators might have preferred to remain somewhat anonymous, right? Using fake names.
That's exactly right. Pseudonyms were incredibly widespread for both authors and illustrators. Sometimes it was because of that perceived negative reputation. Maybe contributing to spicy detective stories wasn't something you wanted associated with your more respectable literary ambitions, if you had them.
Probably protect the brand.
Protect the brand. But just as often, maybe more often, it was simply a practical way to manage the sheer volume of work. If you were writing multiple stories for different magazines or even different series for the same publisher, using different names just made sense. It gave the illusion of a larger stable of writers.
Like we saw with Dashiell Hammett using Peter Collinson.
Exactly. Or the Bertha M. Clayhouse pseudonym we talked about, used by many different writers over the years to keep that successful romance brand going.
But it wasn't just unknown writers or hacks churning this stuff out, was it? Some genuinely acclaimed literary figures also dipped their toes in the pulp pool, which might surprise some people.
It is surprising, but it's true. It's really a testament to the broad appeal and, frankly, the professional opportunities these magazines offered, even if the pay wasn't always great per word. Even Sinclair Lewis, who later won the Nobel Prize for Literature.
Sinclair Lewis wrote for pulps.
He contributed. Early in his career, he wrote filler paragraphs, advertising copy, and a few stories for Adventure magazine, one of the higher quality pulps.
Wow.
It just highlights the surprisingly diverse talent pool that was drawn to the field. You had everyone from aspiring unknowns hoping for a break to established literary giants maybe just looking for a quick paycheck or trying out a different style. Everyone seemed to contribute at some point.
And for the artists, the illustrators, the pulps often served as a kind of crucial training ground, too, right? Or a stepping stone. A really demanding environment that must have honed their skills.
Yes, absolutely. A real trial by fire for many artists. People like John Pellew, who became a respected illustrator. He started out doing bullpen work.
Bullpen? What's that?
That's like the busy, often high-pressure art department trenches, doing layouts, paste-ups, maybe uncredited smaller illustrations, borders, that kind of thing. Grunt work, basically. But from there, they could progress to doing full illustrations, maybe specializing in westerns or sci-fi covers.
Learning on the job.
Learning on the job, often from really good mentors. The sources mention artists learning from world's greatest instructors like Harvey Dunn and George Bridgman, who also taught more formally. They were refining their craft in this high-pressure, high-volume environment, this rigorous practical experience, even if some of the output was maybe hurried or inept, sometimes due to deadlines.
Sure, had to be.
It still fostered a lot of really talented illustrators who definitely left a lasting mark on visual storytelling and commercial art.
It sounds like for many of these creators, both writers and artists, the main focus wasn't necessarily on like high art or even pleasing some vast unknown readership in an abstract way. It was a much more direct business relationship.
Precisely. Frederick C. Davis, the guy who wrote A Story a Week, he articulated this really clearly. He said he was concerned with the reader only indirectly. The reader was the editor's business. My business was the editor.
Wow, that's blunt.
It is blunt, but it's honest about the reality for many pulp creators. It reflects a business model focused squarely on producing formulaic content, efficiently and reliably, tailored directly to what the editor demanded, what the editor thought would sell, not necessarily on deep literary exploration or challenging the audience. That direct, demand-driven approach was really a hallmark of this mass-produced, widely accessible, lowest common denominator, if you will, entertainment. Feed the machine.
Okay, so these magazines weren't just about, static stories on pages that people read and then threw away. They actually built entire communities around their characters and themes. They foster this incredible reader engagement and loyalty, didn't they?
This is a truly fascinating aspect of the pulp era, and it really speaks to their lasting impact beyond just the sales figures. Pulps were amazing at fostering active communities. They did it through things like clubs and services that went way beyond just reading the magazine.
Clubs, like fan club.
Exactly. You could join the Doc Savage Club, which had a formal code and membership pins. There was the Warbirds Flying Club for aviation fans, the Spider League for crime prevention. Dozens and dozens of them. It created this powerful sense of belonging, a shared interest among readers who might otherwise never connect.
That's really sophisticated community building for that era.
Incredibly sophisticated. And get this, even the American Legion, the huge national organization for veterans today, it actually began as a pulp magazine club. It started in the pages of a Street and Smith pulp called the Scrapbook as a way for returning WWI servicemen to connect. That just shows the profound social reach these publications could have.
Wow, I had no idea. And they provided actual services, too. Direct interaction, almost like an early form of, interactive media or a community forum.
That's a great comparison. Exactly. Several pulps ran dedicated information services. Adventure magazine had a famous one called Ask Adventure. Readers could write in and query a panel of experts on pretty much anything: camping, tropical forestry, firearms, navigating British waters, you name it.
Real experts answering reader questions.
Real experts. Other magazines offered challenges like columns dedicated to solving cipher secrets, providing code-breaking puzzles for readers to tackle and send in their solutions. This direct interaction, this participation, it just solidified the community around the magazines. It created a much deeper bond than just passively reading a story.
That's amazing. Yeah. And beyond the stories and the community stuff, just looking at the advertising in these pulps, the sheer diversity of it, that tells us a lot about the interests and maybe the needs of their mass audience, right?
Oh, the advertising is a window into the soul of the era. Absolutely. It was incredibly diverse, a real reflection of the wide range of common interests, anxieties, hopes, and desires of the time. It directly tapped into what the mass market wanted or needed or thought they needed.
What kind of stuff are we talking about?
Everything. It ranged from health and well-being products. You see ads promising remedies for burning feet ended in 3 seconds, or special belts for bladder sufferers.
Questionable cures, probably.
Highly questionable, I'm sure. But also tons of strange novelties. Fountain pens, contraceptives, ads selling live hamsters, false tooth by mail, giant jungle toads.
Giant jungle toads.
Apparently. Radios, eyeglasses, learn ventriloquism secrets, bodybuilding courses, educational correspondence courses, you name it. It just shows how broadly the pulps exploited and catered to their readers' desires, offering solutions, curiosities, and get-rich-quick schemes, addressing the everyday challenges and aspirations of the common person.
It paints a picture of the readership, definitely. And the stories themselves, the characters, they didn't stay confined just to the printed pages, did they? They started to bleed over into other media, particularly radio,
Yeah.
kind of foreshadowing modern media franchises.
That's exactly right. It shows the power of these creations. The Shadow, as we mentioned, actually started as a radio voice before becoming a pulp hero. So that's a case of radio influencing print.
Right, the reverse flow.
But it went the other way, too. The Doc Savage Story Magazine Hour brought Doc's adventures to the airwaves, reaching an even wider audience who maybe didn't read the pulps. This cross-media expansion highlights how powerful these pulp stories and characters were. They were strong enough to successfully transition and thrive across different platforms, proving their inherent appeal and really laying the groundwork for the multimedia franchises we take for granted today.
Okay, so given their immense popularity, their cultural reach, the community building, it seems almost counterintuitive, but the pulp magazines themselves, the format, eventually declined pretty sharply. What happened? What were the external pressures that led to their demise?
Yeah, it's kind of sad in a way, but it was a confluence of factors, really. Several key things converged, especially after World War II.
Like what?
Well, the war itself brought severe paper shortages. Paper rationing had a serious impact on pulp production. Costs went up, quality maybe went down further. That cut into their already thin profit margins.
Okay, wartime pressures. What about after the war?
Post-war, there was a big shift in the publishing industry. In 1949, major publishers like Street and Smith made a strategic decision to move upmarket. They started focusing on slicks, the glossy, higher-quality magazines printed on better paper, like Life or the Saturday Evening Post.
Oh, the glossy magazines.
Right. And that move meant deliberately closing most of their pulp titles. They just didn't fit the new, more upscale image or economic model anymore.
So the publishers themselves abandoned them. And new forms of entertainment must have emerged as competitors too, right? Vying for that same mass audience.
Fierce competition. Crucially, competition from comic books and paperback novels further eroded the pulp's market share. Comic books offered similar visual thrills, maybe even more directly appealing to kids. Paperbacks offered longer stories in a more durable, maybe slightly more respectable format for adults.
Comics and paperbacks,
Yeah.
makes sense. And the elephant in the room.
Television. The widespread expansion of television also drew away the readership that had once devoured pulps by the millions. TV offered a new, dynamic, easily accessible form of home entertainment that pulps just couldn't compete with directly.
Yeah, hard to compete with moving pictures in your living room.
Exactly. Plus, you had economic changes. In a generally more affluent post-war America, that price gap between the cheap pulps and the slicker magazines started to narrow. The main advantage of the pulps, their extreme cheapness, became less compelling. And even things like the rise of men's adventure magazines in the 1950s started drawing away former pulp readers with similar, maybe slightly updated content.
That's a perfect storm of factors.
Hmm.
And there was a final blow to distribution.
Yeah, the often cited sort of nail in the coffin for the pulp era, though not the content, was the 1957 liquidation of the American News Company. They were the primary national distributor for most pulp magazines. When they went under, it just crippled the distribution network for many remaining titles, made it much harder to even get them onto newsstands.
Wow. So the format itself, the cheap paper magazine, largely disappeared. Famous titles like Black Mask, The Shadow, Doc Savage, Weird Tales. They went defunct, at least in their original pulp form, though some were later revived in different formats like digest size or paperbacks.
Right, the classic pulp format died out.
But what about the content? The stories? The cheap thrills themselves? Did that fundamental appeal just die along with the magazines?
And this is the really crucial point, I think. While the format of the pulp magazine declined, the content, the stories, and their core appeal absolutely did not die. It just transformed.
How so?
Well, for one thing, many of the pulp writers themselves simply continued bringing the mores of pulp into the broader publishing spectrum. They just moved platforms. The inherently violent storytelling, the arch dramatics, the focus on simple, compelling narratives. They found new homes, new life.
Where did they go?
Many of those writers transitioned smoothly into writing for the booming paperback original market in the 50s and 60s. Think of all those crime paperbacks, Western paperbacks, sci-fi paperbacks. A lot of that had a direct pulp lineage. And later, many found work writing for television, bringing those same storytelling sensibilities to the small screen.
So it wasn't really extinction, was it? It was more like evolution. That universal craving for escapism, for simplified morality, for thrilling action. It just migrated and adapted into new packages.
Precisely. That's the perfect word. Evolution. The core appeal didn't vanish at all. It merely migrated and evolved into new formats. Comic books obviously carried on the superhero and adventure torch. The paperback industry absorbed huge chunks of the crime, western, romance, and sci-fi genres. And later, television shows and movies picked up the same threads.
You can see the direct line, can't you? From pulp heroes to comic book superheroes, or from hard-boiled pulp detectives to film noir protagonists.
Absolutely. The demand for those thrilling, direct, emotionally resonant stories endures. It just underscores the timeless nature of those basic narrative desires in popular culture. The core appeal of the pulps, that primal craving for compelling narrative, for clear heroes and villains, for escapism, it truly lives on, just in different packages today.
And there you have it, a deep dive into the really dynamic and incredibly influential world of pulp magazines. From their rough origins as, cheap disposable entertainment printed on that rough wood pulp paper,
Right.
to their absolute explosion in popularity, the pulps were a truly foundational cultural force, maybe more than we realize.
I think definitely more than most people realize. They served as that vital entry point to literature for millions, yes, but also as this powerful outlet for really universal human desires. That craving for action, for identity, for simple escapism from the anxieties of daily life. They just brilliantly tapped into the foundational tastes of popular culture, proving the enduring power of those tastes.
And the format itself, the pulp magazine on the newsstand, it may have faded away due to all those pressures. But the core appeal, the essence of the pulps, it didn't die with them at all. It just seamlessly transitioned, didn't it? Into the comic books, the paperbacks, the television shows, the movies that define so much of our modern entertainment landscape.
It's everywhere once you start looking for it. So the provocative thought to leave you with is this. What does this all mean for us today? As we seek out our own cheap thrills, maybe, in the vast landscape of streaming content, social media, digital entertainment, are we, the learners of today, still just looking for the modern equivalent of a pulp hero? Or has our hunger for these universal narratives, these simple, powerful stories, evolved into something entirely new?
That is a fascinating question, something for all of you to ponder as you navigate your own media choices. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.